We all grew up learning history in school, reading it in books, or hearing it passed down in stories. But what if I told you that some of the facts you've always believed about history are completely wrong? From Napoleon's supposed shortness to Vikings in horned helmets, history is filled with myths that stuck around because they were easy to remember, dramatic, or repeated so often that they felt true. Today, we're going to bust 20 of the biggest history myths that people still believe, and reveal what really happened. 1. Myth: Vikings wore horned helmets. One of the most famous images in pop culture is the fierce Viking warrior with a horned helmet. But here's the truth: there is absolutely no evidence that Vikings ever wore horned helmets into battle. Archaeologists have never found one, and contemporary depictions from the Viking Age show simple, practical headgear. The myth actually comes from the 19th century, when costume designers added horns to Viking helmets for Wagner's operas. It looked dramatic on stage, and the image stuck in the popular imagination. Real Vikings would have found horns impractical; they'd get caught in weapons or shields. 2. Myth: Napoleon was short. Napoleon Bonaparte is often remembered as a tiny man with a big temper, even giving rise to the phrase Napoleon complex. But the reality: he wasn't unusually short for his time. Napoleon stood about 5 feet 6 inches or 5 feet 7 inches, which was perfectly average for a Frenchman in the early 1800s. The confusion likely came from a difference in French and British measurement systems, plus British propaganda that mocked him as being small. Far from a dwarf, Napoleon was of normal height and commanded towering influence across Europe. 3. Myth: George Washington had wooden teeth. One of the strangest facts kids learn about America's first president is that his dentures were made of wood. But no dentist has ever found evidence of wooden false teeth. Washington did suffer from terrible dental problems, and he wore several sets of dentures during his life, but they were made of ivory, human teeth purchased from donors, sometimes enslaved people, and even metal parts. They were uncomfortable and unsightly, but not made of wood. The myth likely spread because his ivory dentures became stained over time, making them appear wooden. 4. Myth: Medieval people thought the earth was flat. It's often said that people in the Middle Ages believed the world was flat and that Christopher Columbus bravely sailed into the unknown. In reality, educated Europeans had known the earth was round since ancient Greece. Scholars like Aristotle and Ptolemy had already provided evidence, and medieval scholars inherited that knowledge. The myth of the flat earth Middle Ages was popularized in the 19th century by writers who wanted to paint the medieval period as ignorant compared to the enlightened modern age. 5. Myth: Marie Antoinette said, "Let them eat cake." The infamous phrase "let them eat cake" is often attributed to Marie Antoinette as proof of her disregard for the starving poor of France. But historians agree there is no evidence she ever said it. The phrase actually appeared in the writings of Jean-Jacques Rousseau years before Marie Antoinette was even queen. Over time, political opponents used the quote to paint her as out of touch. In truth, she may have been unpopular, but this quote was pure propaganda. 6. Myth: Columbus discovered America. Children are often taught that Christopher Columbus discovered America in 1492. But that's misleading. Indigenous peoples had been living in the Americas for thousands of years before Columbus arrived. Nor was he the first European. Norse explorer Leif Erikson reached North America around the year 1000, centuries earlier. Columbus's voyages were historically important because they linked the Old World and New World, sparking the Columbian Exchange. But he did not discover a land that was already home to millions. 7. Myth: People in the Middle Ages never bathed. There's a stereotype that medieval Europeans were filthy, never bathed, and lived in constant stink. While hygiene wasn't modern, the idea that no one bathed is false. Many people, especially in cities, visited public bathhouses, and medieval texts describe bathing rituals. Nobles often had private baths, and soap-making was a real industry. The myth came later, as bathhouses fell out of favor due to fears of immorality and disease. 8. Myth: The Great Wall of China is visible from space. You've probably heard that the Great Wall of China is the only man-made object visible from space. This is false. From low Earth orbit, astronauts can sometimes spot large features like cities, airports, or highways, but the Great Wall is too narrow and blends into the natural landscape. What is visible from space are things like the pyramids of Giza or sprawling city lights at night, not a thin stone wall stretching across mountains. 9. Myth: Albert Einstein failed math. Einstein is often used as proof that even geniuses struggle in school, with the claim that he failed math as a student. The truth is the opposite. Einstein excelled in mathematics from an early age. By the age of 12, he was already mastering algebra and calculus. The myth likely arose from confusion over different grading systems, or perhaps from the fact that Einstein did poorly in some non-math subjects. But in math, he was always brilliant. 10. Myth: Gladiators always fought to the death. Hollywood loves to show gladiators fighting until only one survives, but the truth was more complex. Gladiator fights were brutal, but death wasn't always the goal. Gladiators were expensive to train and maintain, so owners didn't want them dying unnecessarily. Many matches ended when one fighter was injured or conceded. Some fights did end in death, but not all. For the Romans, gladiator games were as much entertainment as blood sport. 11. Myth: Witches in Salem were burned at the stake. When we hear about the Salem witch trials of 1692, many imagine women being burned alive. In fact, none of the accused witches in Salem were burned. 19 were hanged, and one man was pressed to death with heavy stones. Burning witches was more common in parts of Europe, not Puritan New England. The myth likely grew from mixing European witch hunts with the American story. 12. Myth: The Trojan horse was definitely real. The story of the Trojan horse, a giant wooden horse filled with Greek soldiers, is one of the most famous legends from antiquity. But historians debate whether it was literal history. It first appears in Homeric epics and later Greek myths. Some believe the horse could have been a metaphor for a siege engine or natural disaster. There is no archaeological proof that such a wooden horse existed. While Troy itself was real, the horse may just be myth. 13. Myth: Ancient Romans didn't have toilets. Some people imagine that Rome, like all ancient cities, lacked sanitation. In reality, Rome had advanced plumbing for its time. Public latrines, sewer systems like the Cloaca Maxima, and aqueducts were marvels of engineering. Of course, hygiene standards weren't modern, but Rome was far from toilet-less. The myth lingers because when Rome fell, much of its infrastructure fell into disrepair, leading to centuries of poorer sanitation. 14. Myth: Only men wore wigs in the 1700s. Powdered wigs are usually associated with men like George Washington, but women also wore wigs, hairpieces, and elaborate styles. In fact, 18th-century women's wigs were often even more elaborate than men's, with high-powdered coiffures decorated with feathers and jewels. The fashion wasn't gender-exclusive. Wigs were simply a sign of wealth and status. 15. Myth: The Library of Alexandria contained all ancient knowledge. The burning of the Library of Alexandria is often portrayed as the greatest intellectual tragedy in history, where all of humanity's knowledge was lost. While the library was important, it never contained all ancient knowledge. There were many other libraries and centers of learning across the ancient world, like in Pergamon and Antioch. The idea of Alexandria as a mythical lost archive is exaggerated. 16. Myth: Mozart wrote perfect music without revisions. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart is sometimes portrayed as a flawless genius who could write symphonies in one sitting. While he was extremely talented, his surviving manuscripts show plenty of corrections and edits. He was fast, but not effortless. The myth likely came from romanticized biographies that wanted to paint Mozart as a supernatural prodigy. In reality, he worked hard and polished his music. 17. Myth: Medieval food was bland. Some believe medieval people ate only dull, tasteless food. But medieval cuisine could be surprisingly flavorful. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, and cloves were prized and widely used among the wealthy. Even common folk flavored foods with herbs, onions, garlic, and preserved items. True, food variety was more limited than today, but medieval meals weren't flavorless slop. 18. Myth: Abraham Lincoln freed all the slaves. Lincoln is remembered as the great emancipator, but the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 didn't free all enslaved people. It applied only to Confederate states still in rebellion, not to border states loyal to the Union. Many enslaved people weren't legally freed until the 13th Amendment in 1865. Lincoln's proclamation was a turning point, but it wasn't the absolute end of slavery. 19. Myth. The first Thanksgiving was a big happy feast. The image of the first Thanksgiving as a harmonious meal between Pilgrims and Native Americans is oversimplified. While there was indeed a harvest celebration in 1621, relations between colonists and indigenous peoples were often tense and violent. The romanticized story came later, especially in the 19th century, when Americans wanted to create a unifying national holiday. The truth is more complicated than the cheerful version taught in schools. 20. Myth. Chastity belts were a common medieval practice. The chastity belt, supposedly used to keep women pure while their husbands were away, is more myth than reality. Most examples in museums are fakes made centuries later as curiosities or jokes. There is little solid evidence that chastity belts were actually used in the Middle Ages. The myth persisted because it fit with stereotypes of a harsh and repressive medieval world. History is full of strange stories, but not all of them are true. Some were propaganda, others came from misunderstandings, and many were simply repeated until people assumed they were fact. By looking closer, we can separate myth from reality, and appreciate the real history that's often even more fascinating than the legend. So the next time someone tells you Napoleon was short or that Vikings wore horned helmets, you'll know the truth.